Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Latino Vote podcast. If the voice sounds a little bit different on this introduction, do not be alarmed. It's our sound system working, and we've decided to make a small change and bring in the smart guy to talk first about what this episode's going to be.
I knew this was a bad idea.
We'll bring in some of the color commentary in just a second. Mr. Rocha, right?
I knew this was a bad idea.
It's a bad idea, for sure.
Just because my little microphone that I bought at Walmart is not working, I don't get to open the show. So I'm just going to put my protest down now.
You don't get the normal buttery voice, but you can stay for the sharp intellect and the even sharper wit. It's going to be a great episode because we have a fantastic guest that I'm very excited about and have worked with in the past, Chuck. So if I could just start introducing her and get right to it, I'd appreciate it.
I'll be quiet. With that? You do that.
In Los Angeles, there is a voice of a journalist who has walked us through some of the most fantastic political stories over the past few years. A Latina by the name of Antonia Cereijido, who works for a national public radio affiliate in the market and has been talking about, again, some of the most not just interesting political stories, but interesting political stories with a Latino perspective. And we decided to bring her on today to talk about a series that she has been working on over the course of the past few months that I think is going to be extraordinarily well received. Imperfect Paradise is an award-winning weekly narrative podcast showcasing some of these stories. And again, I think when you listen to some of these, you're going to find that there is a very broad human story to all of these. The narrative is just fantastic and obviously brings along with it some universal significance. The stories of Latinos as they're unfolding is the American story as we try to drive here on the podcast. And I think what they have put together is going to really illustrate that for all of you. Each of these stories is very, very well reported. For those of you that love podcasts, some of the work, and I've been interviewed on some of her stories in the past. That's not what made them great, Chuck, but it certainly helped. Let's be honest.
Jesus Lord. Here we go.
I'm excited to bring Antonia on the call today, on the pod today, because I want to explore with her and with you some of what she's going to be talking about. Because, you know, I talk a lot about the data. You talk about a lot of the hands-on practical impacts of how we're communicating with Latino voters. But we want to get some of the actual stories, the human side and the human stories of what is happening in our community out. And I think Antonia is right at the cutting edge of all of that. And Antonia, welcome to the show. We're really looking forward to having you on today.
Wow, Mike, thank you. What an intro. And it's such an honor to be on this show. I'm really excited to be here. And yeah, I loved interviewing you in the past, and it's fun to be on the other side.
So the story that we're going to be talking about is again Imperfect Paradise, Return to Mexico. It's a 4-part series. 3 of them have been out for a little bit. The 4th, and I believe this is the last story, just dropped today.
It dropped today. Yeah. Return to Mexico is the look at the story of Daniel Zamora, who was the beginning of the story is like the most tragic. It feels out of a movie. It's very upsetting, but it's also like really moving, which is this young man. He came here as a child from Mexico, wasn't documented. He built a whole life. He went to Grinnell College. He found a boyfriend, and he tells this like really beautiful love story of how they fell in love. And then one weekend they were going to go to like a weekend vacation in Texas. He falls asleep while his boyfriend, who's a gringo, is like driving him to the vacation spot. He wakes up and they're by the border. And it was because the boyfriend just wanted to see the border. And they happen to get pulled over by a police officer and he gets deported. And it all sort of happened extremely fast. I know. It's really heartbreaking. And then as a classic situation, he basically thought like, oh, I can get this all figured out if I just like go back and then I'll figure it out in Mexico. And of course, it ended up being much more complicated. He stayed in Mexico for many years. But the question that the reporter who told us this story, Dorina Rios, had that I thought was like very provocative and really drew me into the series was, what if the dream is moving back to Mexico? Because then Daniel sort of finds himself in Mexico. And I think that we're at this really interesting moment right now with the connection between US and Mexico, with what's happening politically there, what's happening politically here. I know my family is Argentinian, but my dad's family had to escape during the Dirty War and they relocated in Mexico City. So I've grown up going to Mexico City my whole life. And Mexico City is like now a little bit like Gringolandia, but also very much influenced by people who were Mexican, grew up in the US, came back. And there's this moment of fluidity, I think, between the two countries. And I think this story does a really good job at illustrating the very complicated issues that are impacted by policy, identity, and asks some like really, really provocative questions about what is the American dream? Is there a Mexican dream? Questions like that.
I always thought it was really, really interesting. And I know Mike knows much more about this, but it's the storytelling, right? Like me and Mike there's no more establishment Mexicans on either party than me and Mike Madrid. And for both of our mouths to drop as you're telling the story, right? It's like people don't really understand the power of the stories that you've told, the way you've brought this to life. Of like, this is real life. This is what people are going through. So like, I literally tip my hat to you that I'm normally wearing. But walk us through a little bit when you say he found himself when he went back to Mexico. Can you give us a couple examples of that, of what the readers can look forward to hearing?
Yeah, so he found a job as a teacher. He was able to buy a house, which is very difficult for a lot of young people here in the US. And I think also one of the part that is most moving to me is there's a scene where he realizes now that he's back in Mexico that he can travel internationally because before he couldn't. So he goes to Paris.
Wow.
And yeah, and it's just this moment of like, oh, I didn't have the ability to do this before. I could have never been here. And we talk a lot in that episode about the right to mobility and to have agency, and how there's a large political movement in Mexico of people who are asking for the right to move. Like there's a retornado community that organizes around the ability to visit their family in the US, because also now these are a lot of families that are split between the border. But yeah, basically, I think he had made so many assumptions about the US being a better place to live than Mexico. And I think once he was in Mexico, he realized that some of those assumptions were not true.
Let me ask a little bit about that and that return, because as you know, I'm so fascinated by identity and perspective, especially amongst Latinos, because we're a blended people to begin with. So it starts out complicated, right? And then coming to the United States, living that experience, being forced to return, and as you I think so eloquently just put it, Mexico City being kind of Gringolandia, right? Where you have not just a lot of white Americans there, or hipsters going, or retirees going. You're now seeing second, third, fourth generation Mexicanos, Mexican Americans finding and discovering Mexico City. And it's really, I think, challenging or opening up different conceptions of Latinidad, of Latina identity. And who are we and what does that mean? Again, Chuck's probably rolling his eyes because I get into these really deep, complicated questions, and the more complex it gets, the more interested I get in it. And this is the first time I'm hearing this, so I'm of course fascinated by it. But can you talk a little bit about that, especially somebody who's from South America, who spent so much time in Mexico City and now is in Los Angeles, and then to be covering a story of this returning migration back to Mexico City? What do you, just give us a little bit more texture, if you don't mind. What's happening there? What does it mean? What are maybe some examples of what you saw, and where's it all heading?
So we didn't actually end up covering this so much in the series because we ended up really focusing on Daniel, and he is not in Mexico City. He is in Juarez. But Mexico City, we did a story for LAist 2 years ago that I thought was amazing, where they're hosting like Mexican American parties in Mexico City, like Mexican American style parties, like backyard parties in Mexico City, because there's like which I think is just amazing. And it's like a lot of young artists. Like I think Mexico City right now is like a real mecca for art and creativity. I think we think a lot about how like for a city to become a city where there are artists, you have to have sort of like a high quality of life, but like low cost. And that's become increasingly difficult. Like New York City is not the creative hub it once was, because to live there, you have to make so much money.
Right.
Here in Los Angeles, honestly, I would argue we're like kind of in our flop era here. I mean, I know you've seen all this stuff about what's going on in Hollywood, how
Yep.
Hollywood is not doing very well.
Right.
Obviously, journalism is not doing very well. And so I think you see other places really become like a locus of creativity and artistic and also political thought. I think Mexico City is really one of those places. I think people talk about sort of Berlin in a similar way, but I found it really interesting to think that Mexico City is really becoming just a hotspot, obviously for art, and also where like you see a lot of like the innovative ideas coming out of there.
I think seeing Daniel's story and it to me, highlights again what me and Mike talk about. This is the Latino Vote podcast, for God's sakes. The broken system. And now you hear this story that you have told. There's not enough journalists telling these kinds of stories that highlight what's wrong with the system and the real stories that are people. These, when me and Mike talk about immigration, it's one of those things that bring old Mexicans like me and Mike together who have different political philosophies about tactics, is that there's still stories of our families and other families that won't experience what our families did at different times in our lives. I talk like this for a reason. My family's been in Texas for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
But we also are living in a time right now, and Antonia, where every ad that's being run against Democrats in every congressional race is talking about sending immigrants home, these dirty, quote unquote, crime infested, almost like degrading us to animal type things in ads. And it's something that the Republicans have artfully, if you could put that on something that's as disgusting as the way they talk about immigrants, is becoming such a mainstream in the way that now a lot of Latinos in focus groups that I'm doing are like talking about how they came, quote unquote, the right way, and how we should be doing something about immigration. We should have a secure border. It's really stuck with me how we lift up what you're just talking about, what's happening differently culturally, what's going on in Mexico City, what's going on. But then on the other side of the border, immigration has never been a more hotter topic, but for the wrong reasons. How does that all land with you, and how does it show up in your reporting?
Totally. And one of the concerns we had in telling this story was like, what we're saying, like, actually, it's great that people are being deported back to the wonderful land of Mexico. We were like, that's not the point at all of what we're trying to say. And so actually today we have a fourth episode that's Return from Mexico, where the other thing that was interesting for us is that both Daniel's story and the story that came out today are about families that were impacted during the Obama years, when Obama was the quote unquote deporter in chief. And we noticed how similar the election the election season, like when it was Trump versus Hillary versus Biden versus Trump. I mean, we have the same Republican candidate, for God's sakes, and we have a Democrat who was part of an administration that couldn't get comprehensive immigration reform passed. And so we were seeing a lot of the echoes of what we had seen 10 years ago. So we thought it was a good time to sort of see what were the impact of these policies 10 years later. And for Daniel, he was lucky that he was in a situation which he had no dependents. He was a young man. He had an education that he got here in the U.S. But Gloria is the person who's the subject of today's episode. And she is the mother of a family that grew up in Tucson. She has 4 children. She was deported and had to wait 10 years in Mexico to figure out her next step. And so she was separated from her children for 10 years. And now she's finally having the opportunity to come back to Tucson. They're adults. And so we're telling the story of what that process is like. And so, of course, these policies, what I like about this series is that these policies are not going to impact immigrants uniformly. You're going to see many, many different impacts. And I think we wanted to take a really honest look at what those policies meant 10 years ago and how they've played out today. And so that was something we were really interested in exploring. And I think Daniel's story has a happy ending, but it really had a traumatic experience. I mean, the experience of being deported was awful. He was someone who, really wanted to be a member of the United States and be a contributing citizen. And he studied so hard and loved his life here so much and really formed incredible relationships. And those relationships were severed. And all of the work that he had done to become like a contributing member of society, like went down the drain with what happened to him. And I think that it's a huge loss.
The series is called Imperfect Paradise, Return to Mexico. It's a 4-part series that tells the story of Daniel Zamora. Antonia, can you tell our listeners where they can download the podcast, where they can get it, where they can find this story and kind of jump onto this journey with you?
Anywhere you find a podcast, on Apple. I personally like Spotify. I don't know what y'all use to listen to your podcasts, but anywhere you find. And then also on las.com/imperfect paradise, we have digital articles you can read if you'd prefer to read about these stories. So yeah.
And that's laist.com, laist.com. For those of you not in California, Southern California, this is a place to get some really phenomenal cutting edge journalism with stories like the ones that we're talking about today. Can you share with us what you were thinking when you began this journey? What made you decide to take this project on and tell these stories?
Yeah, so I think when it first came to us, I was really curious about the returnee community. Like I felt that was such an interesting that because of policies of deportation, you had so many young people. I don't know if I'm sure you've maybe covered on the show the telemarketing and the call centers across the border. Like there's like so many young people who grew up in the US who were deported back to Mexico and now work at these call centers across the border. And that it's just like they had their own very specific identity of having gone back and forth. And so then Lorena was interested in exploring that because she herself, the narrator of this story is Lorena Rios, who's a fantastic reporter from Mexico. And she brought this story to us. And for her, it was really a personal journey because she had to make a decision. Her visa to stay, her student visa, she came here as a student. Once she was graduating, she had to see whether she wanted to try to figure out a job that would sponsor her here in the US or if she would go back to Mexico. And she ultimately chose to go back to Mexico. And she herself was having a lot of internal sort of questioning about whether that was the right decision. And so that was really like the personal journey that she went on. But something that is interesting also is that the story that came out today about the family in Tucson is that if Biden's executive action had been passed when 10 years ago, she would not have been separated from her children, which also was a surprisingly timely connection to that story, to what's going on right now. So I thought that's also interesting. We really wanted to cover immigration in some way leading up to the election because it's such an important topic right now.
And let me talk about that a little bit. Chuck, I don't mean to jump in here because I know you're going to ask something, but let me, one of the things, and again, I just had a book that came out that goes through some of the demography and the exploding numbers of, what I argue are third and fourth generation that are sort of leading the Latino vote and the Latino community in a very different direction. And I get asked every time I do an interview, well, isn't this just the typical assimilative pattern that every other group, the Irish, the Poles, the Greeks went through at the turn of the last century? And my answer is no, it's unique. And exactly for the reasons that you're outlining in this story and what you're looking at, which is it's unfair to say it's a seamlessness between the border, but the culture exists beyond the border. When you came here to this country 150 years ago through Ellis Island, you were never going back to the country of origin. Here, people literally live on both sides of the border. Their daily experiences is on both sides, and it creates a unique culture. And setting aside that unique part of the diaspora, there is this going home, regularly, seasonally, or for the posadas or for whatever time of the year. And then there's the technology component where there's a constant communication going across. And I'm saying this because it's important that everybody understands, and for those listeners of our show, not only own but be proud of the fact that this is a unique cultural dynamic that is cross-border. It isn't like what the country has experienced before in the past. It shouldn't be dismissed like that. What we're experiencing is something truly, truly unique. And everything that you just explained, because of our country's policies, immigration policies, because of the economy that is requiring labor and markets on both sides in a unique way, this is something that is truly going to become more complex and more cross-border and transnational, and create a culture that has really, I don't think, ever been experienced, maybe ever anywhere before. And it's probably more of a statement than a question there. I'm so intrigued by what you're doing, because you're telling that story through the eyes of some really compelling characters that people feel for, and you want to feel for them, and that you champion them, and they need to be championed, because these are traumatic things that are happening in their stories. And so I'm excited to share these stories with our listeners.
I think you bring up an excellent point, and I do think that is what makes the Latino community, but specifically the Mexican community, much different than any other immigrant group, is that the fact that the border is right there. So there's a lot of going back and forth. Yeah.
I'm interested to know, that there's not enough reporters doing what you're doing, what the LAist is doing, what you've done with getting what I would say your hands dirty on this issue of like some deep reporting. That's not the sexiest thing. We want clicks. We want to talk about the things, my God. I just got back from Mexico. Funny, this whole thing's about Mexico, all this Mexico. I was in the jungles of Mexico down south of Tulum. Anyway, that's for the next week's episode. It's going to be called Escape from the Mangrove Jungle for me and Mike to go through. And then when I got back here, evidently Joe Biden had done some crazy stuff. But anyway, we're going to digress and get to that in a little bit. But what my question is, if you get your hands dirty and you get to really work with folks with real stories, and then you get to read the big publications and all the people that are doing the clickbait reporting, and you get to see me or Mike on TV talking about this stuff. The question is, when it comes to immigration, when it comes with what you've seen other folks, Daniel and others, go through, and it's not just the sympathy part, it's not just the emotional piece of this, but what piece of the story do you think people are missing? What piece of the story is not getting reported enough? Sure, we talk about Donald Trump wanting to literally start immigrant fight clubs. That's what people will report on. Or that he wants to have the biggest deportation in the history of America. Or we will talk about folks that are just streaming in, that are, Mike talks about the day he went down that escalator and started talking shit on Mexicans was the day he lost Mike Madrid, or the final straw, or whatever. I don't want to speak for Mike. But with all of that we see every day, with you on the border, with you talking to people, what's not reported that we should be talking more about?
That's such a good question. And it's interesting because it's the same. It's the same question I actually had at the end of this series, which is, so before I worked at LAist, I worked for NPR's Latino USA for 7 years. And the first story I ever did was a longer documentary story I ever did about immigration, was about the Dream Nine. Do you both remember the Dream Nine?
Mm-hmm.
A group of young people who, yeah. Oh my God. I thought it was an extremely moving story about 9 young people, some who had been deported and others who had not, who decided to cross back into they were undocumented. They purposely crossed into Mexico, and then they crossed back to purposely get detained. They were wearing their caps and gowns, and it was like a big media thing. And then they spent several weeks in detention. And I had seen one of the members of the Dream Nine give a talk. At this point, I was already starting to work with Maria Hinojosa, and I was just so unbelievably moved by the bravery of these young kids. Yeah.
Antonia, was one of those kids named Lulu Martinez?
Yes.
Mike Madrid, Lulu Martinez used to work at Solidarity Strategies. How about that for a full circle event?
Wow.
There you go. Yeah, she worked for me as an intern. when she was still undocumented, like a lot of young Latinos have in DC. Somebody connected me to her, and she worked for me for a summer before returning back to Chicago. Then all of a sudden, I read about her doing this. She was always a super activist. So, oh my God, what all of our worlds colliding here. What a small little world.
That's
Sorry, please.
wild. Yeah, no, that's so interesting. And yeah, a lot of those, I mean, those were young people who were super politically engaged. I did a lot of stuff about the Dreamers when I first started. And I did not think that 10 years later, this is where we would be at all. And I thought by telling those stories about what the young people, why they did the actions that they did, the story of them in the detention center, like I just figured, I'll be honest, this time around, I found myself to be a little bit cynical telling this story.
Right.
I was like, how many times can we tell this same story? And at the last episode, I'm interviewing Fernanda Chauri, the immigration reporter who's been covering this family in Tucson for 10 years. And I go, don't you feel like, why are we still telling this story? Like, I was just like, we've been doing this together now for 10 years. And she was like, the truth is that the implications of these stories are much bigger than just these families. These are people who are members of the community, who are impacting US citizens. Like, these stories have to be told. And that's how I feel. It's like, these stories need to be recorded. It's important for the public record. One day things will change. I don't know in which direction, how it will go, but we're going to need a public record of what happened. And it's not just going to be stats. It has to be the stories of people. When we think of large events in history, sometimes in the moment, it's too hard to process. I think we're going through a lot of that right now, honestly. There is absolutely fatigue of like long form storytelling. We're seeing that across the border in podcasts. Like, there used to be this huge hunger for longer form narrative, and it's not really there in the same way it was before. And I think that's because it's honestly too hard for people to listen to in the moment. But even if it's not today, even if it's 10 years from now, people need to know what was happening emotionally for folks who are going and actually living the experience of these policies. So I think it's really important. And, for this story specifically, I didn't want it to just be like the sad deportation story you hear all the time. I wanted it to be layered and interesting. And I think that's why Daniel was such a compelling character, is because there are a lot of nuances. He finds a lot of joy in his life. There's a love story. I love anything with a love story. So I think all those things are things that like make it compelling today. And I also think that it's important for the voters to understand the emotional implications of what they're doing. We're in an election year. I think you have to think beyond just, when we talk about security, it's such a classic thing when we talk about safety in communities. Like, I think those ideas don't really get to the heart of like what people are living through. And I think it's important to actually, when you're talking about immigrants, who are you talking about? Who are the people that you're referring to? And so I think that even in a small way of just talking about a handful of people, it's important to like know people's names, to know what people's dreams are, what they like, what they care about. Because that's ultimately when you go and you cast your ballot, like, it's impacting the lives of those people. So I think it's very important work. I think sometimes it can be really disheartening, especially this year. I feel like media in general, we're sort of in a really difficult place because there's so much misinformation right now, and people want to hear quick bites, like you were saying, but the work is still important. And if it doesn't resonate now, I know that one day it will resonate.
As somebody who's been exploring these themes for a long time, and as you just said, you've worked with reporters who you've kind of told similar or even the same stories for a decade now. The question might be a little bit unfair, but I'm going to ask it anyway because it's what we do on the show. Where is this all going? Or are we just stuck in a doom loop of this is what the immigration situation is and always will be? Are you seeing changes from the parties? Are you seeing changes? What's different and what's the same and where's it going? Small question, I know.
It's funny, Mike, because driving in today was like, I'm going to ask Mike that question. I was like, where do you think this is going? No, because the last time there was comprehensive reform, it was under Reagan, right? And
Yeah.
like, I just am like, I have the same question. What's it going to take? I don't know. I'm so surprised, honestly. Like I really, when I did that story about I remember doing the Dream 9 story, I just thought things were going to go so differently. And I think I'm really of the generation that, the first person we were part of the generation that first voted for Obama. And I think there is just such a deep disillusionment amongst my generation where there's just a lot of distrust that the Democratic Party is capable of doing a lot of the things that they've said that they've wanted to do, because we just haven't seen a lot of it pan out. So I don't know. There's honestly, I think, at least in the circles that I see in the left, there's like a lot of despair, and I don't know the answer to that question, but I would love to know. If you have thoughts, I'd love to hear them.
Tune in every week.
Yeah. I won't spend
That's
too much
so true.
time.
I mean, yeah.
I won't spend too much time on it, but I will spend a little bit of time on it by saying simply, I'm from a different generation where, I remember right after IRCA, um, that's how far back Chuck and I go. I'm taking
Not
Chuck
sure.
with me on this one.
No.
Um, I have been hopeful every 5 or 6 years that the political winds would get this done, just because it's so commonsensical. It's one of the more frustrating policy issues in America because everybody knows what the solution is. There may be some fine details, but the solution to a comprehensive immigration plan is not complicated from a policy perspective. It's just not. It's the politics that are complicated, and the political will to do it is what's complicated. And I think I was very hopeful that with what Biden was doing through executive action, if half the country likes what he's doing on this one and hates what he's doing on the other, then that's probably the right thing. He's probably doing the right thing. That's how you get to a comprehensive package. And we have lost the ability to legislate that way in this country. So to see him moving proactively on that front, I think was the latest sign of my maybe Pollyannish hope. But I do believe that once we start accomplishing the small things on this, the big things get easier. And again, that may be very Pollyannish. I've been wrong about this more than any issue that I have worked on, and I've worked passionately on this for 3 decades now. I just have to believe that the economic imperative and the cultural imperative and the social imperative at some point breaks through the calcified political system that we've allowed to set in concrete here. And I am hopeful. I think that we are going to get there, and I think that we'll probably get there when we least expect it, because the coalitions in both parties are changing, and the economic imperatives for what we need in terms of economic of reform are really pushing us in a direction where we can't not do anything anymore. That's no longer an acceptable choice, and that's just how I feel about it. I mean, Chuck, what do you think?
Look, I think that this is probably the quickest evolving of anything that we've seen in politics in a long time. And so I think that all of us are just eating around the edges. I think me and Mike go deeper than most, and we don't even really go that deep because it's such a complicated thing, from age to race to country of origin. You just told me about some crazy story of some young Argentinian woman who spent all this time in Mexico City. Like, what the hell? Like, and I grew up in Texas, and I own the nation's largest Latino political consulting firm. But if you close your eyes and don't watch the podcast and just listen, I sound like an old white man, right? But we're all we're all Hispanic. We're all Latinos. And, Daniel's story, all of these stories, I think of them as that portrait of all those little bodies that are shoved together that make a ball that you could just see the ball. But if you look closely at the ball, it's all these little pieces of the ball that make up the ball. Well, that's us in the Latino vote and the Latino diaspora. And so I think that as it's evolving, where we go, we don't know. I think me and Mike do the best because we've watched an evolution of our power politically ebb and flow from the right to the left, of millions and millions of more people just participating. And every year it'll get bigger and bigger and bigger. But I think what you're doing and what folks like you do in this long form journalist investigation, real storytelling, for the folks who don't know our culture, for the folks who have that jaw moment when you say they were just going to look at the border and he got deported. And people are just like, holy shit. this happens in our country every day, but we don't talk about it because it's not the things that gets the clicks. I think is the really important. And the reason we wanted to have you on here is I think that it tells us a lot about where we talk about every day. And so I think it's also important that real stories are here every day. So I really want to appreciate you being here, and I'll kick it back over to Mike to take us out.
The story is called Imperfect Paradise, Return to Mexico. It's a 4-part podcast series you need to pay attention to and be listening to. We're talking to Antonia Cereijido, a journalist with LAist in Los Angeles who has been covering some of the best stories in our community for many, many years. But bring us home in terms of what people should be listening and looking for in this podcast. And let us know again where they can download and hear the stories you are telling.
Well, I also want to thank both of you. I think what you're doing is so important. It's like always, but also in this election year, like making sense of all this, because it is, I think the Latino vote is the perennial question. And I appreciate your deep knowledge that you share with us every week. And yeah, I think Imperfect Paradise, if you're curious, if you like, there are a lot of different series we do on the show. Mike was interviewed for one that we did about this LA City Council tape scandal, where we were the first to get Nuri Martinez on the record after the scandal. So check that out. We then have a series called People versus Karen. That was about a Latino couple that was profiled by a so-called Karen. And then they actually charged the Karen, and it's like sort of it's a court drama story that I think is very good. But I think a lot of our stories cover Latinidad in the plethora of ways on Imperfect Paradise, because if you cover California, you cover Latinos. That's who's here. And yeah, I think this is like a really important time for people to think about Latinidad vis-a-vis also what's going on politically. So yeah, check out Imperfect Paradise wherever you get your podcasts.
Thanks, everybody, for listening to the Latino Vote podcast. We bring you the news that you need to know every week. And I promise you next week, you will hear my voice back on a better microphone. Well, we will be digging into, guess what's happening next week, boys and girls? The Republican convention. You can't see Mike Madrid right now, but his left eye is twitching. It's going to be a good time. We're going to be all Donald Trump all the time. We may even mention Joe Biden. We left Joe Biden out of this podcast this week because you can't turn on a radio or look at a Twitter feed without seeing something about Joe Biden. I would ask you to follow Mike Madrid on Twitter if you really want to see how he feels about Joe Biden right now, because I have spent a week in Mexico just looking at his Twitter account. Tune in, call your mama, hit the like button, subscribe, and until next week, hang on tight.